Keynes, it's a very famous anecdote that's drawn from his book, where in order to explain the system he recommends, Keynes manages to recommend an opposite system, the system against which he is fighting. So the question is, what can you do with paper money, banknotes, when you have a massive amount of unemployment? And the answer is this. If you were to fill up old bottles with banknotes, bury them at a suitable depth in disused coal mines, which are then filled up to the surface with town rubbish, and leave it to private enterprise on well-tried principles of laissez-faire to dig up the notes again, the right to do so, this is the system, the right to do so being obtained, of course, by tendering for leases the note-bearing territory, there need be no more unemployment, and with the help of repercussions, the real income of the community and its capital wealth also would probably become a good deal greater than it actually is. It would indeed, and then he adds, it would indeed be more sensible to build houses and the like, that's the architecture part. But if there are practical and political difficulties in the way of doing this, the above would be better than nothing. So just remember, Keynes is trying to recommend to build houses and the like with money. But he says you may as well fill mines with bottles, trash, and cash. So here you have it, systems thinking, a thought experiment which explains why a system is necessary by describing even its opposite as only a special case of itself. So laissez-faire economics is just a special case of the general theory. So as I said, systems thinking has a way of explaining itself as better than nothing, even if they're actually trying to be everything. So how does a historian deal with this? How does a historian write your way around a system and also explicate it and not get incorporated into it? The answer is to read this book. And I will say no more about that except to introduce the persons we have thankfully with us on stage to introduce it and to respond to it. So Atiya Korakiwala is an assistant professor of architecture here at Columbia. She researches infrastructure, materiality, and aesthetics. Her book in progress is called Famine Landscapes. It's an investigation of the ties between architecture, infrastructure, and hunger in India in the 20th century. Ayala Levine is an associate professor at UCLA. She is the author of Architecture and Development. Subtitle, usefully different, Israeli Construction in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Settler Colonial Imagination. And our third editor who was going to be here was Fabiola Lopez-Duran, but she is held up by migraine. So as a respondent, however, Debashri Mukherjee is a film and media scholar based in New York and here at Columbia. I like that your bio says you're based in New York, but you're also with us. Her book, Bombay Hustle, Making Movies in a Colonial City, does a deep dive into histories of filmmaking in late colonial India. The other person who was going to join us was Paulo Tavares, who was held up in Brazil. He has the author of a number of books and is going to be curating the Venice, the Brazilian Pavilion at the 2023 Venice Architectural Biennial. So the way this works is that I've asked the editors to present for a little while, then Debashri will do a response, they will do a response to that, and then we'll open it up for questions. So please join me in welcoming Long Ado Aggregates and Debashri.
So nice to be here and see familiar and new faces. And especially thank you, Lucia, Jacob, and Jordan for hosting the event and organizing us. And for Debashri for making your comments, and also for Paulo that worked on these comments but is not able to share with us. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. The occasion of book publication is always a happy event, and in this case of aggregate books in general, of which ours is the third, the pleasure is magnified by the collaborative energy that went into its production. The project began in 2012 in an SAH, in the Society of Architecture Historian panel, and a couple of meetings. So Here is one of the first lives of this project. And then again, the project began again with an open call for papers in summer 2017. It involved 2 transparent peer review workshops in the aggregate fashion, the first hybrid and the second fully in person, in which contributors arrived from different parts of the world. And we're very proud of this because people were self-funded and arrived especially for this workshop because it mattered to them so much. The call for papers, as you can see here, invited scholars from various fields to consider 3 overlapping phenomena that reached their heyday from the 50s to the 70s, namely the Bretton Woods currency exchange mechanism, the era of development in the Third World, and the ascendancy of systems thinking and theory that Lucia presented so well as a multidisciplinary ethos affecting multiple knowledge fields, including architecture and urban planning. So in one thing we didn't succeed, our invitation did not yield an interdisciplinary response, so it's quite common to architects to try to include everybody in our discussion and then realize that we are very, we end up talking to ourselves. But we received dozens of submissions from architecture historians, many of whom were still in the process of writing their PhD dissertations. Even 2 of the editors, Atiya and myself, were still PhD students when the project began. This vast response is indicative of the untimeliness of the project, we think, as many PhD students were looking for a body of scholarship to be in conversation with as they developed their research. Unlike in more tailored projects where editors commission select authors to represent various aspects of the argument, here the contributors' input determined the overall makeup of the book. So while the first point about the Bretton Woods monetary system receded to the background, but it's still there with all the international institutions that it enabled, the third point about systems thinking persisted as a substrate in some of the papers, demonstrating exactly the difficulty of what Lucia just said about how to deal with methodologically with that problem. It is, however, the understanding of this period as the era of development that resonated most with the author's respective research interests, even if not all the contributors focus on what we associate nowadays with the global south. So the era of development also included France, for example, as in Arindam's paper. The resulting collection is therefore a reflection of the state of the field, and it anticipates many of the book projects that will follow from our many participants. The book considers the role that the design professions assumed in development. Since development was predominantly an economic discourse, the question we try to answer is how architects and urban planners responded to the growing marginalization of their expertise. Unlike James Scott, who associates the design professions with the high modernist theory or of the state, high modernist authority of the state, or Arturo Escobar, who commented that development was an immense design project, we didn't attribute the design professions any a priori qualities that rendered them particularly useful in the hands of governing institutions and policymakers. It is in fact the other way around. The authors show how the design practitioners fought to assert their relevance and had to refashion their expertise by attaching it to the myriad areas of development intervention, such as health, education, and agriculture, or film, as in Felicity's talk, or how designers try to prove their usefulness vis-a-vis the failings of development. For example, by responding to land speculation or bypassing bureaucracy. Analyzing the ways in which architects face this challenge of relevance, the collection of essays doesn't represent a comprehensive guide to an architecture of development, but rather some of the practices that attempted to insert, a word that you used, Lucia, architecture in development. I'm now going to present Fabiola's part, which is the first time I'm reading, so bear with me. Architecture in Development is overall a collaborative book. In the process of conceiving and writing it, we created a co-learning community, one which requires us to push past our isolated disciplinary and regional silos in the plurality of our voices. Collaborating is never easy, yet it benefits Its benefits are crucial ones. An important lesson of this process has been to understand the importance of thinking from the South as an ideological and geographical position, to reveal this fictional nature of a discipline that has systematically privileged Eurocentric canons and paradigms. Collaboration challenges assumptions and reveals architecture interventions and artifacts as part of other networks, processes, and systems in which both architecture and self play a critical and global role. The chapters of this book are organized around 6 themes: developmental time, expertise, technological transfer, bureaucratic organization, designing the rural, and land. As will become apparent to our readers, beyond these groupings, some of the chapters overlap, interrogating some of the same themes and concerns, but in different regions of the world. The first grouping is titled Developmental Time, to emphasize its attention to processes, to the logic of phase projects and their morphologies as a response to the way budgets were allocated. Including essays by Arin Dandata and Islam Musafar, this session analyzes cases in India, France, and Ghana. Okay. The second section looks at the fates and predicaments of expertise. It moves from Ayala Levine's examination of UN architects planner Otto Königsberger's action plan in Singapore, Israel, Sierra Leone, and India, to essays by Nikki Moore and Diana Martinez, who focusing on Mexico and the Philippines, looking at the architecture of training campuses for perhaps the most significant cultural heroes of development discourse, the agronomists. And also in this section, the collaborative of Sebastian Lucen, Viviana Doria, and Hilde Heinen turns to the academic ramifications in Belgium of Habitat, the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements, held in 1976 in Vancouver, Canada. The third group of essays pertains to questions of bureaucratic organization. This group includes essays by Felicity Scott, Ginger Nolan, and Albert Lopez, and moves from the proceedings of the Habitat Conference in Vancouver and its audiovisual program analyzed by Scott to the work of Nolan on Christopher Alexander in India and the work of Lopez on Carlos Lazo Barrerio in Mexico. The next section, Ate, this is yours. Okay, I just realized.
Distribute Fabiola's voice a little bit. And she's very missed. She's very missed right now. And we're really grateful for this, slide that she made to sort of demonstrate the breadth of this project. So the next section on technological transfer takes the reader to Melanie Sunmin Park's work on the interfaces of labor and technology in South Korea. Yeah. To Manuel Schwarzberg-Carrillo's examination of the US housing industry's prioritization of steel in Palm Springs, California. The displacement of Native American communities in that area and the new worker settlements in Ciudad Guyana, Venezuela, an industrial enclave supplying steel to American markets. And finally, to Farhan Karim's essay on the construction of tradition in fostering development in the shape of so-called earth-based technologies and strategies of the self-help, the strategies of self-help. The section titled Designing the Rural has the largest number of contributions. This is not a coincidence. At the turn of the 1950s, the developing world dwelt by a large margin outside of cities and urban settlements. In this section, Olga Tulumi and Petros Fouqueiras examine the design and construction of villages in the countrysides of countries as different as India and Zambia. Oh, I'm one ahead, sorry. While Martin Hershenzon and Atiya Korakiwala look at building typologies from cowsheds to silos devised to build up capital accumulation in the countryside of Israel and India. My own contribution to the book follows Nelson Rockefeller's use of Venezuelan oil camps as laboratories for agricultural production and consumption, creating a comprehensive compensatory system and using a seamless aesthetic of a sterilized and rationalized rurality centered on food. The last session of the book addresses an essential element of architecture that architectural discourse has addressed little in the last several decades: land. Focusing on Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus, essays by Burak Erdem, Paniota Paila, and Konstantina Kalfa shows how the political economy of land became one of the most fraught problems in development discourse. Land continues to be exceptionally resistant to its transformation into a purely economic element. This selection of essays reflects the breadth and scope of submissions we received, which conspicuously lacked scholars working on socialist modes of development from the Soviet bloc and the non-aligned movement. This absence in our book was not by design. Okay, so to switch to my bit, thank you for hosting us, and thank you, Devashri, for reading. I look forward to the comments. I will try and offer some of the insights that emerged from the book. As always, to begin with some caveats, the book is not comprehensive of development, and neither will my comments be, but mainly I offer up some signposts that coincide, but not fully, with the structure and division of the book. So I should go to this slide, yeah. They don't line up neatly with the sections, and a lot of the themes cut across many of the chapters. And I hope to underscore some of the contradictions that we address and that emerge about what development hoped to be and what it became. Paradoxes were produced because development theory wanted to do two opposite things. It wanted to both manage the economy and let the economy unfold. And so from here, we kind of end up with some contradictions. So one contradiction, for instance, is that development succeeded as a discourse even as it failed as a theory. So while the economics of development failed both in theory and in practice, and didn't really install the imagined industrial modernity, the industrial modernity that it imagined in the global south, the word development still has power, and it still continues to be deployed with that power in many different spheres that, we still aim to develop many different parts of the world and call those parts of the world undeveloped and underdeveloped and use various versions of those words. Follow-up to this point, to paraphrase Arturo Escobar, development was this immense design project, and Ayala quoted that as well. It was structurally all-encompassing and totalizing, and yet it had little space for designers. So this, again, is a kind of contradiction there, specifically architects. And architects in this schema were subordinate to economists, they were subordinate to bureaucrats and planners, and this put pressure on the profession to redefine its expertise. And so that really goes to that section on expertise. And I think expertise is one of those themes that really cuts across all of the chapters, which is why I'm beginning with that. And bureaucracy kind of is fit in here. So this would be, what this insight is that experts are, This insight really relates to the fact that experts are all over the place in these stories, in these chapters. But expertise is not so much that of bringing authority and knowledge which in other stories, that have talked about development and expertise have led to all sorts of unintended consequences, but rather architects fashion themselves as experts in translation. They interpret between the world of economics and the world of people. So given that this system embraced every aspect of life, eating, education, work, health, leisure, all of these spheres, the architect becomes capable of translating and interpreting between these different aspects. They exhibit a power of care, a power of management. That becomes their way of entering into this system. So even as they have to translate between people working on the economy and the emerging unmodern subject of the modern state, they have to do this work of socializing the people, quote unquote. So the outcome of this is that, one outcome of this is how architects tend towards town planning. They tend towards regional planning. They tend towards becoming capable of negotiating between these different scales, from the scale of the person to the scale of the nation state. The next big point is about developmental time, that first section, and this point is about the temporality of development. There is this concern for process over object over project. Instead of projecting an end, an imagined conclusion, architects design processes with no idea of that end in mind. Something new and unknown can possibly emerge when we design process. Process becomes more important than project, but at the same time, architects become capable of fantasizing and prophesizing a different and unknowable future. And so this, again, goes to that kind of expertise of translation. And in that sense, this developmental temporality connects up with the temporality of the nation state, which is that of a constantly deferred future, a constantly delayed promise, the promise that never arrives. On the other hand, this leads, on the question of this horizon of incompletion, on the horizon of this incompletion, we have the question of technology transfer. This is really an attempt to skill the unskilled, the unwitting subject of modernity, who has been left behind. This skilling involves a huge component of self-help, a turn to natural materials, cheap materials, community building, even community building, right? So the subject is to be taught how to both build their own houses and their own communities. And then this section on technological transfer connects up to this other section on designing the rural, where if the subject of technological transfer is the poor rural subject, then the architect aims to give them agency in this world that they don't have. And the rural is both, well, first it's imagined as this Rousseauian ideal, self-contained, bounded, a community, but this is contradictorily, the rural is also imagined as a site of accumulation, the accumulation of capital. And so the rural gets caught between these two poles, the pole of, the fantasy of the ideal community, where people are eventually self-sufficient and skilled and independent, and on the other hand, it is caught between, the rural becomes a key locus of economization, the site of accumulation of capital. And so this condition of the rural and the rural subject is caught between these two opposing poles of fantasy and economy. The last section then is land, and here too, because of its juridical and symbolic nature, land resists economization. And because of this, because of how it resists this kind of entry into the developmental sphere in economic terms, it becomes one of the most fraught aspects of development. And so to conclude, what happens is that this set of, I really didn't want to say developments, but I couldn't help it. These developments set the stage for the emergence of the global south. And that's that title, that's how that emerges in the title. Because of how this part of the world becomes a place of extraction, even as its industrial modernity is stymied by the structural forces that, to quote the historian Vinay Lal, put the third world in the waiting room of history. So that's.
Okay, so first of all, thank you to Lucia for a very creative, experimental decision to invite me to be a respondent here today. Huge congratulations for this very hefty tome. It's a real delight to be meeting Ayala and to be in conversation with Atya and Ayala, two very musically resonant names, bringing more joy on this bleak kind of day. Thank you for everyone for being here. Okay, so what I want to do is, as the film scholar in the room, I'm going to use two clips. And they're from a film that some of you might have seen. I'd screened it a few years ago. It's a film from 2017, a documentary film that was made collaboratively by an architect and a filmmaker from India. It's called Nostalgia for the Future, made by Rohan Shivkumar and Avijit Mukul Kishore. And it's a film broadly on Indian modernity, the production of the citizen subject, and the architecture of the home. So I'm going to show us a little clip from about 30 minutes into the film, in which we will see a glimpse of public housing built in New Delhi in the wake of independence and partition, and the developmental fervor of a technocratic nation. And then I'm going to use that clip to kind of talk to some of the big themes that I took away from the book. Okay.
सफ़ेद पोशाक में इंजीनियर साहब आए, दाढ़ी बनाकर, साफ सुथरे सफ़ेद, पूर्णिमा के चांद की तरह सफ़ेद। इनके हाथों हमारा उद्धार लिखा था। इनका अस्त्र, इनकी बुद्धिमत्ता, जो अव्यवस्था से व्यवस्था छीन लाती, सतह देखकर भीतर की गहराई भांप लेती। इनका अस्त्र विज्ञान। आधुनिकता की कल्पना नागरिकों की एकजुट होकर एक ही समय काल में अपने इतिहास और भूगोल की भिन्नता मिटाकर सांस से सांस मिलाकर काम करने में है। विविधता और समानता की धुंधली रेखाएं पहचानने में है। दिल्ली शहर स्वाधीनता के बाद बहुत तेजी से बढ़ा। भारत के विभाजन के बाद जहां करोड़ों शरणार्थियों को आश्रय चाहिए था, वहीं देश की राजधानी के विशाल सरकारी तंत्र और उसके अफसरों को निवास।
The refugee colonies were laid out in good modern style. Actually, it was not very different from civil lines in the British way of doing things, where you just had road access, you have plots, and then you had accommodation with a little bit of a setback, and you were given a minimal space to live in. When you come to the new imagination, everything is according to a concept of what constitutes modern living. And all these other, at that time, modern or futuristic advantages of the city, like piped water supply, and sewage, and electricity, motorized transport, meshed into this idea of the garden. That on the one side, and also, I think there was a kind of an engineering mindset. Right? So architecture is actually very basic and is not imbued by any of the cultural values overtly, although those are implicit in the way things were done. Whether people were happy with it or not, it's very difficult to say, but on the whole, it was a very happy place. It is partly because all those who came to inhabit the new spaces were actually immigrants. And for them, this was not too much of a disjunct, because most of them were employees of the state.
Okay. It's interesting also for those of you that are used to this, a certain style of state-sponsored documentary film from India, that the filmmakers are doing their critical commentary in this particular mode of voiceover intonation, which is also like the expert commentator telling you what modernity is and so on. So there's much to discuss here, but I want to pick on that closing line about the happy living managed by a new kind of social figure, the middle-class Indian who was employed by the state, lived in public housing, and was learning to be a modern citizen. These were immigrants and refugees, survivors of intense communal violence, state-engineered famine, and mass displacement. As we revisit the architectural meanings of modernity with this book, is there space to acknowledge these kinds of violence? And this is, to my mind, one of the central questions of this anthology. I think one of the reasons why I am on this panel today is because of some urgent conversations that some of us in this room had during the MoMA show, The Project of Independence, last year. And as Athiya had noted in a review that she wrote about the show, and I'm quoting, that the show was steeped in longing for a return to a more hopeful time when architects made nation states. And that's the end of the quote. And many of us were unsettled by this nostalgia in that show, by an accounting of the 1950s, 60s, 70s as a kind of romantic project of independence rather than a project of active and painful decolonization, a project of reckoning with colonial trauma and the trauma of civil war, with the paternalism of a state that mistook the aspirations of a society for the aspirations of an economy. Nostalgia, romance, yearning for a past were all mixed up in this exhibition with an overriding sense of failure, incompletion, and crisis, which are words that recur in this anthology, which seeks to reframe existing discussions on 20th century global modernity through the lens of development. Editorially, this is a political economy approach to the circulation of certain built forms and certain attendant theories of design in the post-war Bretton Woods era. There is an argument about an epistemic vision that emerges from a new economic regime based on the infinite exchangeability of the American dollar, a vision wherein the world and its component parts, be they in the hinterland or in the imperial periphery, are infinitely modular. To impose this frictionless modular order onto the world, we need an army of globe-trotting experts, consultants, and planners. Not quite the globe-trotting bourgeoisie from the Communist Manifesto, but close. And we have remarkable stories in this book about figures such as Jacqueline Turwitt, and very interesting, her under-recognized influence on Marshall McLuhan, and very interesting discussion of the emergence of the term the global village in that section that Athiya was talking about the rural. So coming back to development, the term itself may be tricky to define, but the editors are more interested in the knowledge practices, the design projects, and the social epistemic actors that were produced under the sign of development. One of the looming actors in the book, apart from all the individuals that are mentioned, is the vastly expanded state, with a paradoxically enlarged purview even in an age of liberalism. The essays examine the emergence of new nation states alongside this expanded mandate of the state, with its dependence on Bretton Woods institutions for loans and expertise, and along with that, massive kind of debt concomitant with institutions such as the IMF and so on. Now, the developmentalist mandate was not and could not be in practice frictionless, which is why the word conflict comes up at several places in the book. And it is in the first section of the book that we get some contours of this conflict. So for a book about architecture, this conflict is necessarily mapped onto discussions of space. As Arindam Adatta explains, the 1960s global development system necessitated, and I quote, a veritable army of geographers, sociologists, statisticians, and planners who set to work modeling national space in the image of the mathematical field formalisms propounded by economists. And he continues, space, in other words, was another name for geographical unevenness, the inevitable imbalances and conflicts emerging from historical divergences of capital formation, technological absorption, cultural habit, political resistance, and so on, between localities and regions. And that's the end Madhav Datta's quote. Now, all the contributors, to my mind, in varying registers, are keen to underline the violence and the conflict baked into this era. And to do this, it is necessary to confront that word and that vision, development. And as the editorial introduction notes, to radically disassemble this word development and to move it beyond, again, in the words of the editors, move development beyond the innocuousness of terms such as global modernism and colonial modernities that have a risk of erasing the sinews again of conflict encountered in these globalizing and modernizing projects. And that's from page 2 of the introduction. Now, in this sense, this is a book about development as decolonization and globalization, but properly named development as neo-imperial control. Now, Timothy Mitchell, a colleague of mine, in Rule of Experts, a book from 2002, has argued that the project of economic reform in Egypt was a work of both theory and violence. And this is a view I think that the editors and the contributors echo in this anthology. The epistemic violence of certain abstractions and dualisms had material consequences that continue till this day. To quote again from Mitchell, making the market economy required a series of framings which attempted to fix and exclude, such as simple dualities of real versus representation, objects versus ideas, nature versus technoscience, land versus the abstraction of law, the country versus the map. Thus, for example, as Olga Tulumi outlines in their essay, Jacqueline Turwit's proposal for a model Indian village commissioned by the United Nations bypassed any considerations for religious spaces, perhaps hoping that the sticky problems of caste and religious division would simply disappear. And I'm quoting now from Tulomi's essay. For Turwit, the principal desire was not to enter into the intricacies of rural society and economy, but rather to fix the position of the village within a network of expertise and distribution of resources. End of quote. But the frictions and the conflicts continue. And in a sense, it all starts to come apart within a decade. And so we return to this idea of failure, which was one of these overriding, unsettling feelings that we got from that MoMA exhibition. And the book begins and ends with a discussion of failure. The editors propose the idea of development time, as we've just heard in the introduction, a temporal extension that seeks to manage contingency by prolonging infinitely the promised horizon of arrival. And Ateya Khorakiwala returns to this idea of deferral in her essay, where she discusses the substitution of materials and designs as a technique to sidestep the aporia of development in which structural change remained a perpetually deferred promise. There is a certain messianic horizon to development, and I think all media theorists also continually run up against this horizon and its very strange, magical kind of theology. When will we get 100% electrification? When will our homes become completely smart? The authors contend that the term failure is not adequate to the task of truly understanding what it is that unsettles us still about development. And the term failure also misnames the condition. And here it's salient that Ateya invokes Ashish Nandi on the success of the idea of development and its continued political power. And by political power, I mean the magical ability it has in terms of political invocation in electoral campaigns that continue across the world and aid in various populist kinds of programs across the globe. So I have a question at this point. For Mitchell, economics needs abstraction and the simplification that abstraction yields in order to exist. Models and then systems are a part of this project of simplification. Mitchell says that economic expertise is forced largely to overlook the forms of leakage, network, energy, violence, and irrationality that he discusses in the book. Because economic expertise cannot take them seriously, for that is not its task. And yet this outside, these excesses are vital to capitalism. They are a source of its energies, the condition of its success, the possibility of its power to reproduce. They are a heterogeneity that makes possible the logic of capital and thus ensures both its powers and its failures. And this is the last line in the rule of experts. So my question is this a kind of optimism about the social messiness of built form, for example? This is that leakage. It's the leakage. It's happening right now. So I'm asking, is this something optimistic that's happening right now? Is this roof just going to reveal the sky now? That would be cool. I would expect that from GSA. No, so I just have a question about, is this a kind of optimism, this kind of social messiness of built form, and do you share this optimism? Because it seems that the project of mapping resistance is not urgent in this book, right? So why is it that you made that decision? And then I think more from a media studies kind of a perspective. I can talk if people can hear. Okay. And then the question about what are these other terms that are not systems or models like networks, assemblages, leakages? Can they offer something here? Instead of, say, straightforwardly resistance, agency, and so on. I had one more part if we can just collect another thing, right? So I wanted to also come back to the question of films. Now, films played a very big part, as you'll see in the book, in the Bretton Woods institutions and the post-war developmentalist networks. Because films do a lot of work to both explicate and extol these ideas, to facilitate exchange and translation. Felicity Scott's essay, for example, takes this dimension on quite centrally. And here I'd like to note that there is an increasing focus within film studies as well to think about the role of media forms as systems. And as Lee Griefson has put it in a recent book, to think of the role of media systems in the emergence and expansion of a global capitalist system that has been and continues to be brutally violent, unequal, and destructive. And this is because the traditional focus in film studies has been on fictional, narrative, and artistic genres of filmmaking rather than on pedagogic films. Films that many are now terming useful cinema, a directly utilitarian cinema of the kind that we see enmeshed in these histories of developmentalism. And this enmeshing between this useful cinema and developmentalist projects happen at various dizzying levels. And I was reminded of something from my own life. So for example, I studied filmmaking way back when at the institute and at a school in Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi, which is called the Mass Communication Research Center. It was set up in 1982 in collaboration with York University, Toronto, and the Canadian International Development Aid Agency. Now, the Canadian Development Aid Agency provided my school with a range of equipment, and York University sent the first generation of teachers, which was led by distinguished documentary filmmaker James Beveridge, a close associate of documentary pioneer John Grierson, the founder of the National Film Board of Canada. And not just this, the building in which I had my classes and my studio and all of that was designed by celebrated modernist architect Raj Rewal, who designed the Hall of Nations Pavilion at the Pragati Maidan, which was recently demolished as a monstrosity of a bygone era. And a lot of that MoMA show was also working with our own kind of nostalgia about things lost. So there is more to unpack here, but I want to end with an overwhelming kind of sense that we also get in the book that development fundamentally has a pedagogic imperative. Some countries and some peoples must continually strive towards self-education with a kind of a borrowed syllabus. And what is it that we must learn? And here, if I could just play my last clip, because there's something here that takes us back to that first line in Atya's review of the MoMA show, which is about what are architects, what are nation states, and what is longing, and what is it that we learn. So I will just end with this. It's a shorter clip than the first one that we watched.
शरीर देश है, देश शहर है, शहर मशीन है। हम सब इस मशीन के कल पुर्जे हैं।
नंबर बताओ। 72 नंबर जी। चलो नंबर बताओ। 12 नंबर।
चलिए। आपका क्या नंबर? 16 नंबर। चलिए। आप कौन नंबर?
नंबर तो मालूम नहीं।
कौन सा माला?
तीसरा माला। नहीं, चौथा। नहीं, ऊपर है बाबू।
इस बिल्डिंग में रहते हैं और नंबर नहीं मालूम?
छोड़ना मत, भागने मत देना।
हमारे साथ
है आया है।
So now we have the sort of multiple responses to the responses. I don't know. All of you should think of your questions while we have our two authors. I don't know. Atia, do you want to go first, and then Ayala, or is there something?
No, I think just about, like, one of the projects seemed to be about kind of diagnosing this moment through this kind of design and theory imperatives through various case studies and locations. But you didn't seem that interested in counter movements or practices.
We are Are we recorded?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Broadcasted even. Okay. I have a short answer about the optimism of the method. We're using architecture as method to get messy with theory, right? So the problem with analysts of the discourse of development, and I'm thinking of Escobar, who was very much influenced by Foucault when he thought about development as discourse, is that they don't go into materialities. And the thinking about the power of discourse, but it's also, as Foucault says, it's cracks, or cracks would be for ideology, but the moment where you have different flows of power within discourse is something that is missed when you don't think about the materialities of a discourse. So this is why architecture is such a good vehicle to interrogate that. So in this sense, we're thinking of architecture just as a lens, as a method to look into the materialities of discourse, or how it gave form, but also conflicted form, as you're saying. And by form, I mean not just aesthetic form, but form in terms of method. And then I had another thought. So excuse me, it's been a long night. Discourse, materialities, optimism. Oh, the other thing is that I think that you can do that with a lot of other disciplines. You can do that with medicine, you can do that with education. Architecture is not privileged in this sense. All the other disciplines, all those disciplines that have materiality in them, that have circulation of materials, of laboratories, of doctors, experts, the building of hospitals and the building of university campuses, all there involve a lot of other disciplines. And this is why systems is so, and this is already tapping into your next question, systems is such a useful mechanism for experts, a language that they can talk, where they can shift between those heterogeneities, between those different fields of knowledges. And that's why we use system as a problem rather than as a useful analytic tool.
Yeah, so this is a fascinating question and also a really good diagnosis, because I think it speaks to, and maybe this is slightly unsatisfying as an answer, but it speaks to how so much of the work in here was, one of the first rounds of processing archival work for so many of the scholars working, on their dissertations, on their first books, on their research. And I think that in a way, the resistance parts of them got edited out. In a sense, because it was this, because it was like, oh, that will be in another part of the book. That's the unsatisfying part. Like, no, their books, like, so each of them go on to write their dissertations, and they have these, and their books, and they have these like large bodies of material and work that come together in those frames. But then this book was about sort of distilling that system, that the aspect of it that intersected with the kind of developmental drive, and trying to kind of understand that in the context of this emerging global,
Yeah, I mean, and it's great to hear that, because also very useful to hear in the beginning that so much of this was like work in progress being done like through dissertation writing, and I can't wait for the books to come out. So, and it's also something that I was thinking, because I was reading Lee Griefson's book, which is called Cinema and the Wealth of Nations, which ends pretty much at the moment of Bretton Woods. So it's 1920s to 40s. But it's also interested in these kind of global, like a globalizing system of capital that seeks to kind of flatten many things. And in that, he takes this question very seriously, saying that I'm not interested right now in offering these counter narratives of resistance, because it's about time that we laid out that diagnostic project first, which is new, I think, in many of our disciplines. It's not a conversation we've been having. So.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a complaint, it was just an opportunity to hear what.
No, but it was fascinating that you picked up on it, because it really is something that that I think as editors we sort of encountered, and somehow because of what the project was, it ended up in a different place. But there are multiplicities within this book, as in with any edited volume.
I think of that as it's very interesting when you asked about other terms, and your examples were networks, assemblage. I can't read my own handwriting. Linkages is something, because those, of course, are also have, in a way, had a moment in our discipline as the explanatory device, a previous generation, basically, of explaining these global projects. Or precisely, you can imagine the shift from networks to global modernism is much faster. And so I also think of the insistence on systems in this project as being that, a way to avoid the all too easy equation of materiality with that architectural thing which is networked, that architectural thing which is put together, as opposed to just this argument which is about systems themselves. Any answers to the second question, which is on pedagogy, and it's...
It wasn't a question. I mean, I think I just highlighted a few themes that to me seemed particularly urgent, like politically, like the conflict part of it, violence, deconstructing certain histories that I thought very compellingly were argued as having been flattened by certain other terms. Terms that we all use, those of us that do post-colonial studies. Colonial modernity. What's Bombay in the 1930s? It's all colonial modernity. So I think some very important and timely kind of alerts that the book provides.
Yeah, and it's sort of funny because to use that term colonial modernity is actually about asserting that modernity is everywhere, right? That you can't pretend that there is no modernity in the periphery. And so it's sort of, there's a kind of cycle, like there's a kind of feedback here, which is that for each of these, we need to kind of nuance them. Yeah, where was I going with that thought? Somewhere. No, on the pedagogical front, and on the kind of paternalistic nation state front, yeah, I think that, you know, in a way that subject to some extent is missing from the book, you know, because it is focusing on the pedagogy, the production of that kind of subjectivity and the ignoring of that subject, which is just, I mean, even in the film, you know, it's always in the background and it's always an image rather than an actual interaction with that person, and the subject, and the sort of focus is always on the engineer or the instrument even. Yeah, no, and it's nice to sort of see that clip because it's very tongue-in-cheek about the voice of God, right? And I think we're trying to figure out a way to write about this time without that voice of God. And also there are various, I know Felicity.
Yeah, I was going to do,
various
there are some authors in the
audience.
room as well. So a question that I had maybe to start to open it up, and if the authors are here, they can respond. It has to do with this contemporary impulse to nostalgia, or to, I mean, you both spoke about it very well, and then you were cited additionally that this discomfort, we're supposed to feel queasy about the 60s and 70s because we're supposed to think that independence, that it was a project of positive independence. So that, we know the show that this was about, and so I was just going to ask whether those who have worked with other geographies are experiencing that today too. Is there a revisionist, I don't know, exhibitions, and is there a revisionist literature in other, I don't know, I suppose about all the different spots that Fabiola highlighted on her map, against which this is also understood? I don't know, maybe I guess in the case of Israel that's very unique, but in the sort of African geographies that you deal with, Ayala, do you feel like there's also a contemporary project under the name of salvaging, under the name of, you know, against demolition, to impose a kind of nostalgic view of this period?
This is actually something I teach because I encountered this colonial nostalgia or post-colonial nostalgia while doing research, and it was very hard to grapple with. I encountered it from my research assistants who were showing me places, but I also encountered it as I went into the archival depth and came out of it reading, seeing around me whatever I just read in the archive, as if time has stopped in the 60s. So this is something that I myself had to work out, because I was not trained specifically as a historian. Like, nobody ever told me how to go to an archive, but then I was definitely not trained as an anthropologist. So I didn't know how to negotiate those discrepancies and negotiate the fact that I have electric outage and I now experience development and cannot do work because of that, and just understanding what it means to live in development time. So I am still working this thing out. There's also a question of just going to the field. What does that mean in terms of, it's just an entirely different experience of archive. And I think, Atiyah, for you it's a bit different because you are from India. So this negotiation is different. So there is also that kind of qualitative difference. So I think I think that also my project, the Israel book, faults on these lines of there was a time when there was some multidirectionality. So there is some sense of, I don't want to say nostalgia because that will put me in a bad position, but there is a sense of I want to look at this optimistically. I want to look at it from the perspective of African decolonizing states, but it is a perspective of the governments. It is a perspective of elites and how and where things can go bad really fast, as you said, within a decade and even less.
I was going to say that one of the biggest challenges, I think, to the scholarship of this time has been the call from scholars not to think of decolonization as a historical moment, but as an ongoing project. I think that sort of really put some pressure on thinking of those years of decolonization as a kind of historical moment. The other thing is, I think this book, it doesn't attack it directly, but it grapples with the persistence of the nation state that should have, by all accounts, been an absolute failure, but in fact emerged from this even stronger. And then how do you account for that strengthening of this? In the Indian case, at least, the nation state really becomes a place of claims making. It becomes the thing to protest against, which doesn't track in every kind of state, like in every model of that kind of question of resistance. But I think that that's still open because, as much as the state, in a sense, is a thing that is done with, we are done with it, theoretically, but it's not done with us, exactly. It's sort of emerged in its kind of nationalist and jingoist and, religious and weird forms that we're not able to yet fully contend with even more force.
But it's interesting that Fred Cooper also talks about development as this thing that allows for claim making, the decolonizing claim making of the state. So it's the state and the world, and then there are the citizens or non-citizens against the state. It's like different scales of claim making.
Okay, so any questions from the audience? And now I'm not seeing the authors. Zainab has a question. Is there...
Yeah, I know, we should.
No, I wasn't planning to speak. We're here to listen to the editors. But I do have maybe one question, and I guess I'll pose it to the two para-Fabiolas, yeah? Just because I think it came up in her part of your introduction, which was the geographies that are covered by the book, and whether there's anything about the lens of systems that drew from certain areas and not from others. And Fabiola pointed to the absence of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but we could also point out the surprising absence of Latin America. And so I just in terms of the editorial process, do you think this is an absence of at the time of the call of a body of research that was identifying those? I mean, obviously Worker Steineck, but he had his own book project, or just trying to get a sense of how you read that geographic distribution, in relationship to the
now,
project.
like an international organization, you have to answer for your globality.
It's true. It's like, of course there's biographical accidents, right? Like Lukáš is writing his book, not that that's to say that he would have written for us otherwise, but I know for sure that Ana Maria was in the middle of her book project, and of course there are biographical accidents, but I think, what you're also asking about is some of the kind of theoretical emergences that on the one hand try to explain the whole global south, but fail to explain the whole global south, and then those kind of show up as absences within even what we really, really wanted to be a kind of more democratic project in which everybody spoke. We had these meetings where we broke up into groups and we talked and we read each other's papers, and we and it was that everyone didn't stay from that like there's a different set of papers in the end than that group that had the meetings, and yet, and in a sense, that sort of speaks to how some of those papers didn't find themselves as fitting within that kind of larger arc. And so the sort of bright side of this is that means that there's other books to be written, and there's conversations to be had and challenges to the model. And yeah, that's what I will say.
It's interesting though, because systems thinking was very strong, both in the Soviet Union and Latin America. So there are, like, there's the question of the aggregate reach in terms of the call for papers. So that's about in the institutions. There is also, I think that the Bretton Woods prominence in the call for papers may have detracted people from associating their work with this. Although in the call for papers there is a sentence saying, "We welcome papers from the Eastern Bloc."
I took the microphone back.
Five expertise.
Oh.
Yeah.
No, just that it wasn't in our in our set of expertise to be able to address it as a competing economic terrain that had different ways in which it dovetailed into, say, the Indian experience, or.
I just want to put a good word also for Paulo Tavares, who said he has written his response and will hand it to you, but I think that was going to be also his ability to sort of compare, basically. So. Yeah.
I just want to add, I should have begun by congratulating you, which I think is an extraordinary achievement and a decade of important work, and I think a really major volume that I've been using in my teaching this semester. And anyway, so I should have begun that way. And so it was not a critique, my question. Actually, it was just more a lens question, and like thinking what that means in terms of articulating other,
Strangely, I had exactly the same question, but maybe I could, first of all, congratulations. It's really a huge achievement. And I know how much work it took you. I witnessed it. But I mean, I don't want to press the same point all over again, but I also had a question about that Fabiola circle. And not just, I mean, I'm hoping that you can also answer in a way that is not just in terms of the contingencies of the aggregate group, but really in terms of how this discourse of development forms an other or world outside of itself. You know, it's interesting. Yeah, the systems thinking may have been same in both the Soviet and the Bretton Woods system, and yet they were something else. And a similar thing, it seems to be happening now when you listen to the news, and what China is doing in Africa is supposed to be the other to what America is doing or the United States is doing. And so, can you talk about the outside of this discourse in a more structural way, perhaps, rather than a biographical and
I think just to add to that, I would say because of the map that we saw from Fabiola, my way of asking this question would be, given that in the introduction you addressed the question of first, second, third world and how that system kind of was so useful in so many violent ways, can we also discuss global south, right, in that sense of what is south, and not outside, but the south inside the north, which is hinted at definitely in the essays, but just to have a more clear kind of discussion of that.
Sorry, I have to leave. Sorry for a flight. True. But I'll just give my 2 cents about the theory question of development. To answer Zeynep's point, I do think that there were variants of development theory or modernization theory. It's interesting how the discourse was, on the one hand, everybody assumed that there is development and there is modernization on all sides of the globe of where you're going to look at it, but there were variations within the theory itself, and systems thinking in the Soviet Union was not the same systems thinking as promoted, for example, at MIT, and it actually caused an interesting crisis of knowledge when cybernetics specialists from the Soviet Union had to accommodate to neoliberalism. So there are variations, and our book did not allow for these variations so much to be theorized as such. So that is another next book. And I wish there was such a next book. I really am invested in the possibility of even thinking about all the participants within the Bretton Woods institutions from the Global South as having something else to contribute. That there are variations within knowledge production and within those institutions that also are being incorporated into the institutional thinking within the US. And I really would like to hear Ataya's response, but I have to go. Thank you so much. There is a storm coming.
Yes,
apparently.
Ayala's flight has been moved up because of the storm. Thank you so much for coming and for joining us. Atiya, you're not off the hook for the answer to this.
No,
And
I have
then
a
Reinhold
I
has
have
a
thoughts.
question. So.
Yeah, no, but this is to get into the question of the Global South. What
Yes,
is the
good,
Global
yeah.
South? Why does that have this different territoriality than the Third World, and all of these questions, which are sort of hinted at, the emergence of the Global South, right? Like in the systems and in the aggregate code word systems in the South, what is the South versus the Global South? And okay, so what's my answer to this? The answer is, I think that what happens is that development theory, the way in which economists are theorizing it, here I'm thinking of people like Gadgil and the economists in India who are working and producing formulae for how resources will be allocated through the 5-year planning systems. They are trying to do this sort of have your cake and eat it, or eat your cake and have it too, as Arindam likes to say, which is that you really want the kind of liberal model, you want to use liberal economic theory, classical economics, but you would like to also have Keynesian macroeconomics at hand. And so what that ends up doing is that it ends up producing a kind of management of the nation state, which, as one of the, to quote the book, is, becomes too big for small things, too small for big things. So one more of those kind of contradictions that emerges from here, which is that what ends up happening is that to be able to industrialize, you have to find a kind of hinterland. And so that is the kind of South within the North, or rather North within the South, that occurs in that block that was in Fabiola's slide. And then this really creates the conditions for, because Global South, we tend to think of it as the global, thinking globally about the South of the world, but it's the other way around. It's actually thinking about the South, which is the extractive zone, and then expanding that to think about where all it exists in the globe, because there's the South all over the globe in this kind of economic sense. And then that becomes, to kind of bring up the Chinese infrastructure example, given that development is completely dismantled, and we are living in a completely neoliberal world, that the theory of development is dismantled. The discourse of it allows for then these new connections to be made, which then allow capital to flow into parts of the world that could never before have sort of had that kind of real positionality of being sites of extraction without any even concern of installing an industrial modernity, right? That's gone. There's no question. Nobody is installing industrial modernity anywhere anymore.
I mean, I have a semi-answer from the Egyptian archive that there are, and this is not to critique the map that Fabiola in absentia cannot be asked about, but the whole is not, of course, over the Soviet bloc itself, but there are locations in which the Soviets are operating. And so in the case of Egypt, the same projects which are proposed for the World Bank are floated to the East and the West. And then in the case of Egypt, the development projects are picked up by the Soviets. So my sense from one answer there is that it really puts pressure on to what extent the states, the sponsoring states, are believing in institutions or not, because the relation of state and institution on the eastern side is different. And the relation of states among themselves is a different mode of federation than this kind of international institution. So that could be one answer, that in fact the terrain is the same in many places. There are competing projects and projects that go back and forth, just in some places, and actually a little earlier than the 60s and 70s and the 40s. And that what is really changing is the channels that are opened up by it. Anyways, just one answer. Reinhold?
Yeah, no, first of all, congratulations. I mean, I don't know to whom at this point one must address this. And I too am eagerly, haven't made it through everything, but eagerly reading and using some of this for teaching already. But, so Deborah, I mean, there's so much to say about DDA housing and the Pragati Maidan and all of that. I mean, that's maybe for after, but to pick up on the conversation, I'm trying to reframe my thoughts to pick this up. First, to Lucia's question, I would suggest, the earlier question you asked about alternative, I would say oppositional thought and practice rather than merely resistance. I would suggest Adam Getachu's book, World Making After Empire, you guys probably know, on African anti-colonial and anti-capitalist thought and practice, and Quinn Slobodian's Globalist, which even within the emerging world order discovers South-led anti-globalist, anti-Bretton Woods pro-proposals practices that eventually are suppressed. So, I mean, because this isn't just a linear story. I mean, that's basically what everybody's talking about. And my question had to do, therefore, with another theory from the South, which is a little more closely related to that literature, that uses systems thought, world systems theory. This is an interested question because I'm thinking about this myself at this point. This is developed in various ways, but not entirely by chance by Emmanuel Wallerstein and others in Tanzania. And it's not just any Tanzania, it's Nyerere Tanzania, which is to say the socialist South. So we're talking about, kind of socialist opposition from within at this point, by the time that this is all happening. It is not just the Europeans coming down, what Lukáš writes about, but within, and developing programs and thought, and people like Walter Rodney and Dar es Salaam side by side with Origi and Wallerstein, developing not just a critique, but a different map. And so the map, this has its own limitations, I think, but maybe it's useful to at least compare, which is the sort of famous three-zone map of core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And so countries like China and Brazil would wind up probably at this point certainly in the semi-periphery, and many of the Eastern European countries as well. And then core is usually Europe, North America. And if we, but also there's a different time horizon. This is, especially in Wallerstein's version, a Brodelian time horizon, which is like longue durée, centuries. So the temporalities that I know some of the essays refer to around development shift. It's not to say that revolutions and or decolonial, formal decolonization is just a ripple on the surface of the sea, but rather that there are longer-term processes also underway, having to do with what you're just talking about, the development, and as Rodney put it, underdevelopment of these zones. So I just wonder whether this discourse and came into being as a critique of modernization theory and even of dependency theory and all the development discourse. So it's deriving from the same places that you're starting. So what do you think?
Any Wallersteinian aspects to the memories that you've had in the many years of this project? Atiya is now standing for the entire group.
I know, it's not fair. It's like, who else can we ask? Who Who else was in these meetings? He was there. Where are they? They're out there in the ether somewhere, I'm sure. I'm sure Arindam has an answer to this.
I mean, and I want this, I don't know, I really don't want to. No, because also, you know, I want it to now move to be a conversation later on outside.
All right, well, are there any other questions, burning or not burning, occasional, methodological or content-based? More? Take the mic.
I'm just kind of curious, related to this too, and Brodell writes about this as well, the kind of irreconcilability between a kind of systematic approach and a historical approach was in your working on this, like, how did you find a way of writing historically about something like a system which in a way resists the diachronic dimension and insists on like a synchronic, like momentary cut almost? And how did they too, kind of like the people taking on these systems, reconcile the fact that they were trying to bring about some kind of historical and temporal change? About, you know, I'm just kind of curious about the whole developmental time question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so I think my answer would be a little bit as to how, and to just stay with the Indian case a little bit, because it's the one I'm most familiar with, how economists are placing where the kind of economy, the Indian economy is in the Rostovian scale. And so it's sort of, if we can get out of this historical mode, or rather a stuckness, and create a kind of new set of conditions, if we can create the conditions for takeoff, right? It's creating a kind of set of, and then it will unfold on its own. So I think that is, I think historically we're looking at archives, right? So we're saying this, in terms of how, and I mean, again, not to speak for everybody brought different historical approaches to this material. It is a very deeply archival book. So that's, I think, key to remember. So, you know, in my own work, I have certain kinds of, like, how do I treat this question? I can answer that, if not for, because it's also kind of, there's a lot of people in here, and they're all in the middle of their own projects. But in my work, at least, the question became, how does someone like Gadgil, who is interested in the question of crisis and war and using those as points to retool an economy, how is he reading Keynes? So how is he, so I mean, it becomes, to me, it's not, I'm not, of course it is possible to historicize systemic thinking. How is it, that just proves that I'm in the history camp. That's all it does, right? Like, because I'm not, I can't think, I'm not a system thinker. I'm not a person who will ever think that this kind of system is overarching and persistent. But it is sort of, I mean, to your question of how, I think it is this sort of economic abstraction of imagining that you can install certain possible conditions that then this process can unfold, and that's the lack of historicity, right? Like, this process will unfold the same way every time. It's yeah.
So, to transition to the part where people can privately ask you about this.
Thank you.
Thank you both immensely for, first of all, congratulations on the book. It's incredible. It's a real treat to read. It's very rigorous, it's deeply archival, and still brings up all the sort of questions that Debashri, notwithstanding her non-disciplinarily, amazingly diagnosed as being part of basically daily life, like a diagnosis of daily life that is permeated by these systems. So thank you also for the absolutely on point. I think from now on, all responses to architectural things should bring films. Just to remind us of how the engineer is seen in white. And, you know. And thank you all to the audience as well. Congratulations again.
you so much. I appreciate you.